Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc. When we think about historical crimes, we often picture, those dusty courtrooms and yellowed parchments. But today we're really going beyond those kind of typical images, and we're exploring how burial practices and these accusations of witchcraft intersected, especially in 18th century Scotland. We've got some captivating cases, and honestly, I'm itching to unpack them with our experts.
What I find most intriguing is how these cases reveal the human stories, behind the headlines. We're not just talking about abstract concepts. We're talking about real people whose lives were really profoundly affected by these accusations and the social anxieties that fueled them.
Right. And it's not just skimming the surface here, We've got historical records, we've got expert analyses, and even some firsthand accounts that we're going to dig into. So buckle up, because we're about to uncover some truly unsettling truths about how fear and superstition shaped the course of justice back then.
And it all starts with this story of Lilius Eide. She died in prison while she was awaiting trial for witchcraft. Now, because she wasn't actually convicted, her body wasn't burned like many others who were accused of witchcraft. Instead, they buried her beneath the Tideline. Can you imagine that?
Buried beneath the Tideline? Why on earth would they do that?
Well, at the time, it was believed that burying someone beneath the Tideline would prevent their spirit from returning. People were genuinely afraid of revenants, those who returned from the dead and saw them as like potential agents of the devil. It's a grim reminder of how deeply intertwined superstition and the legal system were back then.
Wow, that's just heavy. To think that even in death, Lilius wasn't granted peace. And to add insult to injury in 1852, an antiquarian actually desecrated her grave.
Yeah.
Talk about a lack of respect for the deceased, especially someone who was already unjustly accused in life.
It really makes you question how we as a society treat those accused of crimes, both historically and in the present. Do we afford them the dignity they deserve, even in death? What does it say about us if we don't?
That's a question we'll keep circling back to throughout our exploration. But for now, let's kind of shift gears and dive into the world of witchcraft confessions. These documents are like windows into the minds of those accused, but they're also incredibly tricky to interpret.
Absolutely. Take, for instance, Isabel Smith's confession from 1662. It explicitly states that many of the claims attributed to her were probably true, but not actually spoken by her. It's a chilling example of how the very process of confession could be manipulated.
So how do we make sense of these confessions, knowing that torture and coercion were often used? Were these people genuinely admitting to practicing witchcraft, or were they simply saying whatever they needed to survive?
It's a complex question, and there's no easy answer. We know that sleep deprivation was a common tactic, and then there was the bridle, a device specifically designed to silence and humiliate the accused.
The bridle. What was that like?
Imagine a metal contraption that clamped onto the head with a piece that went into the mouth, essentially preventing speech. The discomfort and humiliation inflicted by this device were significant, even if those in power didn't consider it torture in the traditional sense.
It's clear that these interrogation techniques were designed to break people, to force them to say whatever their accusers wanted to hear.
Precisely. And it wasn't just physical coercion either. We have to consider the impact of what we might call social contagion. Imagine living in a community where everyone's talking about witchcraft, where pamphlets detailing these horrific acts of sorcery are circulating. It creates an atmosphere of fear and paranoia that's almost impossible to escape.
So people might have confessed to things they didn't actually do simply because they were swept up in this collective hysteria?
So it's a real possibility. There's a documented case of a young girl who confessed to having sex with the devil, a common accusation during the witch trials. However, she later recanted that specific detail, which raises some fascinating questions.
What could possibly explain that change of heart? Was she pressured into saying it initially?
Perhaps. It's also possible that the fear that initially compelled her to confess subsided when she was removed from that immediate pressure of the interrogation. Or maybe she realized the gravity of the accusation and its potential consequences. It's a reminder that even these seemingly official confessions are often layered with complexities and contradictions. As we explore these historical cases, it becomes pretty apparent that accusations of witchcraft often serve as like a convenient scapegoat for societal anxieties and power struggles. It's almost as if anything unexplained, like a sudden illness, a crop failure, a personal misfortune, could be attributed to witchcraft.
It's really unsettling to think about how easily suspicion could turn into accusation and how quickly those accusations could escalate into full-blown trials.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, women often bore the brunt of these accusations. Take, for example, the case of Isabel Gowdy. Her confession is filled with vivid details about meeting with the devil and participating in acts of maleficium, including harming livestock and using elf shot to cause illness.
Elf shot. What exactly is that?
It was believed that witches could use elf-shot, these like invisible projectiles, to inflict pain and suffering on people and animals. It's a fascinating example of how folklore and superstition intertwined with these accusations.
It's hard to separate fact from fiction in these confessions. Did Isabel genuinely believe these things, or was she simply just trying to appease her interrogators?
That's the question that lingers over so many of these cases. We'll never know for sure what was going through Isabel's mind, but her story reminds us to approach these confessions with a critical eye, always considering the context of fear and coercion in which they were given.
Right, because as we've discussed, the line between victim and perpetrator can become blurry in these cases. It's important to remember that these accused individuals were often subjected to unimaginable pressure and manipulation.
Absolutely. And speaking of blurred lines, let's talk about the role of the church in these trials. Their involvement was complex and often contradictory. Well, on the one hand, the church condemned witchcraft as a sin, a threat to Christian society. But on the other hand, their sermons and teachings often fueled the very fears and paranoia that led to these accusations. It's a fascinating paradox.
So in a way, they were both fighting against witchcraft and inadvertently creating the conditions for its persecution.
Precisely. And their authority lent legitimacy to these accusations. We see this clearly in the North Berwick witch trials. Remember King James VI, the one who was initially so obsessed with witchcraft? Well, he played a key role in these trials.
What did he do?
Not only did he believe the accusations against those accused, but he actively participated in their interrogation. He saw himself as a defender of Christianity against the forces of darkness, and these trials became a national spectacle.
It sounds like he was using these trials to consolidate his power and assert his authority over both the church and the legal system.
You're absolutely right. And the accusations against the Northborough witches were particularly chilling. They were accused of conspiring with the devil to raise storms, sink ships, even harm the king himself. These accusations played directly into James's own anxieties and paranoia.
So he was both the investigator and the alleged victim, which created a very dangerous dynamic. And let's not forget the influence of the Malleus Maleficarum, that infamous witch-hunting manual.
Ah, yes, the Malleus. It essentially provided a blueprint for identifying and prosecuting witches, and it was deeply misogynistic.
Misogynistic? How?
It demonized women, portraying them as inherently susceptible to the devil's influence, prone to deception and wickedness. It played a huge role in shaping the legal framework for these trials and perpetuating harmful stereotypes.
It's terrifying to think that a book could have such a profound impact on the lives of so many people.
It's a reminder that ideas have power, and even seemingly authoritative texts can be deeply flawed and dangerous.
So if these texts and these beliefs were so deeply ingrained, how did things eventually start to change?
Well, as the trials went on, some people began to have doubts. The case of Janet Douglas, Lady Glamis, is a prime example.
What happened to her?
She was a noblewoman accused of witchcraft by her own brother, who was after her lands and titles. It was a highly politicized trial, and despite flimsy evidence, she was convicted and executed.
Her case is a perfect illustration of how accusations of witchcraft could be weaponized for personal gain.
Exactly. But her case also sparked outrage and skepticism among some members of the Scottish elite. They saw it as a blatant abuse of power, and it led to a growing unease with the witch-hunting system.
So this wasn't just a shift in intellectual thought, but also a social and political awakening to the dangers of these unchecked accusations.
Precisely. People were beginning to question the motives behind these accusations and demanding more rigorous standards of evidence.
And that shift in thinking eventually led to the decline of the witch trials. But as we'll see in the final part of our exploration, the legacy of these events would continue to haunt Scotland for generations to come. We've been talking about how attitudes toward witchcraft accusations changed towards the end of the 17th century. People were demanding more evidence and were more skeptical of those outlandish claims. What were some of the factors that drove this shift?
Well, one of the key figures in this shift was, surprisingly, King James VI. We talked about his obsession with witchcraft, but over time, he actually became pretty disillusioned with the trials.
That's interesting. What changed his mind?
Well, he started to question the validity of what was known as spectral evidence. This was basically evidence based on dreams, visions, or the testimony of those who claimed to have been bewitched.
So it relied on subjective experiences rather than like concrete proof.
Exactly. And James, being kind of the intellectual that he was, started to see the flaws in this kind of evidence. He realized how easily it could be fabricated or influenced by, personal biases and agendas.
So it wasn't just a change of heart for James, but a realization of the flaws in the legal system itself.
Precisely. And this realization led to him implementing stricter guidelines for evidence in witchcraft trials. It became much harder to convict someone solely on spectral evidence or coerced confessions.
So in a way, James, who had initially fanned the flames of the witch hunt, ended up playing a role in curbing its excesses.
Yes, and this shift in the legal landscape coincided with a growing public awareness of how the witch hunt system could be manipulated for personal gain. People started seeing how accusations could be used to, settle scores, seize property, or silence dissenters.
So it wasn't just about the validity of the evidence, but also about the motives behind the accusations themselves.
Exactly. People began to understand that power, whether religious or political, could be easily corrupted, and those who held it needed to be held accountable.
But even though the trials declined, the impact they had on Scottish society was pretty immense.
You're right. The trials left behind a legacy of fear and suspicion that lingered for generations. It eroded trust within communities, fueled paranoia, and stifled critical thinking.
It's a reminder that the damage inflicted by these events extends far beyond the individuals who were directly accused and punished.
And tragically, the stories of those who were accused, their lives and experiences, were often overshadowed by those sensationalized accounts of their alleged crimes. It's only in recent times that we've begun to reclaim their stories, to see them not as demonic figures, but as real people caught in a web of fear and superstition.
And that, I believe, is one of the most important takeaways from our exploration today. It's not just about understanding the past, it's about recognizing the human cost of these events and learning from the mistakes of those who came before us.
We must be vigilant against the dangers of groupthink, the abuse of power, and the tendency to scapegoat those who are different or marginalized.
We can't change the past, but we can use it to inform our present and to shape a future where justice, reason, and compassion prevail.
A future where the stories of those who were unjustly accused and punished are remembered and honored, not erased or demonized.
Well, that will give our dynamic duo something to think about in their weekly review on Sunday. But in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.